Flags? Is it army? Is it gold? Is it money? Stories, my friends. Stories. And what a story we've heard of betrayal, of courage to fight for values and principles, defeat and utter humiliation, and yet an indomitable will to bounce back and defend nationhood as Santiman and write our own true and unadulterated history. What you've just witnessed, Prof. Tom, is the Da Nsiomu dance, a very ancient and popular dance among us, the Ashanti, which is going extinct. We reenact it today in your distinguished honor to thank you for your amazing work, which has been a labor of love for us, the Ashanti people, of whom you now belong to, as a father and a brother. To you, we say, Yadawasia and Sada, Eja ni Onya Mccaskie. Please, a round of applause. We proceed now in this celebration by acknowledging the causes of the war, the cause of the war, Ashanti-man after the war, but most importantly, the significance of what this anniversary means to our nation moving on. We're delighted to have eminent men and women who are herein gathered to lend us their thoughts on the way forward. Make welcome our moderator, who will be seated right in the middle, a son of Ashanti-man, who is the Ellen Gane Professor of History and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, a proud fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a corresponding fellow of the Royal Historical Society, UK, Professor Emmanuel Achampong. Seated with him, make welcome an adjunct lecturer and gender historian affiliated to the Department of History and Political Studies at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology here in Kumasi, Professor Eugenia Anderson. In their distinguished company, from the Department of History and Political Studies at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology is Ghana's first trained social historian of medicine. Make welcome Professor Samuel Edujemfi. With joy, we receive the former research coordinator of the History and Politics section of the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana, Professor Samuel Intewusu. And last but certainly not the least, our brother, our father, Professor of Ashanti History at the Center of West African Studies, Birmingham University, UK, Professor Tom Mccaskie. Prof, the moderator, you have an hour to deliberate.
His Royal Highness, Nana Otumfo Setutu Abebu, Nana Drabinghini, Chair of our Silver Jubilee Planning Committee, Nananum, Honorable Ministers and Parliamentarians, the Vice Chancellor, my academic colleagues, since I'm in a university, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to stand on all previous protocols which acknowledged our present dignitaries. As Jerry mentioned, my name is Emmanuel Achampong. I'm a professor at Harvard. I will briefly give you the context and the format for the symposium, and then I'll sit down. So we are looking at the last quarter of a century, so from about 1874 through the Yasantua War of 1900-1901. Some of my colleagues may share reflections that might go a little forward than that. We have 4 speakers. So our first speaker would be Tom Mccaskie to provide a big picture. So we are looking at how the Amanhene and the Amantuo fared in this last quarter of the 19th century. So a big view. And then Samuel Edujemfi will come after that and provide a perspective from Kumasi, a cosmopolitan city, a royal city, and the perspective on this last quarter of a century. Then we'll go to Professor Samuel Intewusu, who will look at the missionary factor, both in Sagranti, going through the annexation in 1896-1900. After all, it was the taking of the Ramsiers and Kune, Bonat, keeping them in Kumasi for 4 years, that incited the sentiments that would lead or feed into Sagranti War. It is also important to note that as the 1896 expedition came, they were followed by missionaries. So it is not surprising that some of the earliest photographs we have of the submission of Prempeh and his mother are from the archives of the Basel missionaries, because they followed the invasion of 1896. Then we'll go to Eugenia Anderson, and I've been enjoying conversations with her these last few days. I've had the pleasure of being associated with 2 histories by 2 Asante. The first one by Prempeh I, when he was in the Seychelles, and then the present one that we will launch by Prempeh II. In conversations with Eugenia, she challenged me to reflect on what a history of Asante could look like if dictated by an Asante Hima, and what that female perspective of Asante could look like. And I think I'll sit with that for some time to come. Each speaker will have 12 minutes for opening remarks, maximum 15 minutes. Because they are professors, they are welcome to come to the podium to share their opening reflections. I encourage them to look in my direction, so when I do this, you know you have 3 more minutes, and when I do this, you know you have to stop talking. And since Otumfo is here, stop talking, you stop talking. After they finish, we will open up for Q&A, and I'll ask the audience to ask a question. Let it be a question or a very brief comment. We are creating something called Asantipedia, which will be a popular platform online for individuals and families to deposit stories they have from their families between about 1874 and Prempeh I's return in 1924. So if you have good stories, that's where it should be, so that as many people as possible can ask short questions. So that's the format, and I will now invite Tom Mccaskie to start us off. So let us welcome Professor Tom Mccaskie.
You will be getting tired of looking at me, I think. But I've been called back to talk a little about what happened to Asante after the Sagranti War. After the Sagranti War, Kofi Kakari was destooled because he had presided over the humiliation of Asante. The trouble was that his successor on the golden stool was his brother Mensa Bonsu. Now, Mensa Bonsu was a man of avaricious, greedy, and vicious temperament, and is remembered as such today. He had a low, whispering voice, and if he could not hear you, or you could not hear him, he would fine you or punish you. He was that sort of person. And in the conditions that followed the Segrenti War, he was a tyrant, and he is remembered as such. He died on the Prasu in 1900, and his sons had him disinterred and reburied in Kumasi in 1911, and there was a huge outcry against this happening, but the British allowed it to take place. Well, going back to his reign, he thoroughly alienated almost everybody in Ashanti, and he began this by invading Juaben in 1875 to, in his view, bring it to heel. The Juaben had fled once before, but they fled this time south again to Kovarejuat, New Juaben, and they would not return. And this opened the floodgates. Without that unity, and Asantehene was respected and who could impose his will and interpret custom properly, without that, all kinds of conflicts broke out in Asante. Adansi against Bekwai, Mampong against Idweso, etc., etc., etc. And these are covered enormously in Prempeh II's book, which you'll be very happy to hear I'm not going to read to you. And he, excuse me, and so these conflicts spread throughout Asante. When I was introduced, it was mentioned that I had written a book on a Kumasi village between 1850 and 1950. That village is now in Kumasi. It's Adibeba, which belonged to the Manweri stool. And in that book, I was able to cite testimonies of people who'd lived through the Civil War of 1883 to 1888 that were collected in the 1940s. And it was a period of intense deprivation. People starved to death. People were homeless. People were refugees. And meanwhile, the warlords, the Amenhene, who had asserted themselves against Mensa Bonsu, descended into a civil war between themselves. The country was in ruins. Kumasi, in the end of the 1880s, was in a terrible condition. An Englishman on his way to Jaman in the Ivory Coast visited it in 1889 and said it was virtually in ruins. It was nothing like it, the way it had been portrayed in the early 19th century by earlier English visitors. And so, Ajuman Prempeh came to the stool in 1888 amidst these ruins. And he set about repairing the Asanteman, bringing it back together as best he could. And he had some notable successes. An expedition to Nkoranza in 1892 brought the Nkoranzahene back into the fold of the Asanteman and its dependents. But of course, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Ajuman Prempeh could do nothing about the British. And so, while he was desperately trying to get the Asanteman reunited under his authority, the British came, as I mentioned in my first address, the British came to take him away in 1896. Now, in Prempeh II's history, there is an account of the debate that he had with his chiefs about what he was going to do. And he said to them, if we fight, we will all be killed and Asante will be ruined. So I will sacrifice myself as the Asantehene and go as a prisoner with the British so that they will not fight here and they will not make the Civil War even worse. So Prempeh was taken away with his mother and his father, Kwesi Jambibi, off to jail in Elmina. And the Asante were not happy about this. They were very unhappy about it indeed, which is why, as I said, that war broke out in 1900, 1901, the Ya Asante Wako. Now, It is very difficult to compress and to tell you in any detail, in fact I can't, nobody could, the events of that period between 1883, between 1875 rather, and 1900 when Prempeh was taken away. They are immensely complicated, but certain things need to be noted, even if only briefly. Firstly, Prempeh had some notable successes. As I said, in the Carranza and with a number of the areas around Kumasi. But he could not stem the tide of disaffection that had been caused by the sheer anarchy of the war and the brutalities inflicted during it. Not only that, but now the British deliberately seduced dissident Ashanti who were against Prempeh, to come south into the Gold Coast colony, as indeed the Juaben had done in 1875, and there they were given both protection and allowed to plot against the Asantehene Agyeman Prempeh. Now, these are a very significant group of people, and the reason is simple. They were the people that the British relied on as collaborators once they had occupied Kumasi again in 1900 and turned it into a crown colony in 1901. And these people were placed on the stools, the senior stools, the Abrempog stools and the Amanidi stools of those who had been deported ultimately to the Seychelles with Prempeh. Now there's a long and complex history here. You'll be relieved. Again, I'm not going to go into it, but let me simply say this. The first 20 years of British rule are really about getting rid of these collaborators. The Asante people themselves would not put up with these people. People like Kwame Bwachi and Agoda, or Kwame Tua, the Jazwa Stool, or the British informant Kwesi Appiah Nuama, Kwame Tua's brother, who was made Achiamihini by the British. They would not put up with this, and eventually, one way or another, all of these chiefs were removed. But after Prempeh came back in 1924, of course, the British would not in any way countenance that he become ruler again. That had to wait until 1931, when he was reinstated not as Asantehene, but as ruler of the Kumasi division, and nothing else. And it took 4 more years of petitioning, of trying to persuade the British to have the Confederacy restored. Now, I'm going to finish by talking about the Confederacy. The Confederacy that the British restored was restored under the precepts of British custom and British law. The principle was decentralization. They would not, for their own political reasons, accord the authority that Kumasi had enjoyed in the pre-colonial period, and they encouraged, if not secession, then forms of independent action by all these Aman. And Prempeh II spent most of his long reign between 1931 and 1970, when he was not playing golf but I was carrying his clubs. He spent most of his long reign trying to restore the old Asante, the Asantehene's authority, the Asantehene's arbitration of custom, and these forms of traditional government back in Asante. And that struggle, I'm going to name no names, but that struggle, as you all know, everybody in this room knows, goes on to this day. I will merely mention, in conclusion, Kumasi. When I first came here in 1968, Kumasi had 100,000 people. Now it's got 4.25 million people. Where is the land to come from? Well, we know that right now, as I speak, land is the biggest issue in Kumasi. And the Asantehene has to defend the Golden Stool's rights in the land in Kumasi, which were taken away by the British and then restored only in part in the 1940s. So there are still battles to fight here, and I hope they're battles that will be won. Thank you very much.